to talk essentially about my research, which is a large part of it was in microfinance to start off with. But since I've been researching Indian development over the last 3 years, you cannot possibly not be involved with a very large scheme called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. And this particular opportunity gave me to sort of put everything together and think about this topic. So let me start off by saying that there are two kinds of employment, all right? One is the employment which is generated through the process of growth, and for which you have to be aware that the nature of employment generation that you see in a country is really an impact of the labor laws that you have in that country. Meaning, the nature of technology that different, the growth takes in itself, whether it's a capital intensive growth or it's a labor intensive growth, depends on how costly it is to hire labor in that country. Meaning labor laws are very, very elementary. They're very key to determining the nature of the growth, whether it is employment generating or is it capital intensive. So in the Indian context, unfortunately, where we seem to have leapfrogged from agriculture to services. So we have a missing middle, which is manufacturing. It's small, and unfortunately it's stagnant. The worst form of it, though, is that it's essentially capital-intensive manufacturing, which you can imagine for a labor-rich country, it can be quite a challenge. So keep that at the back of your mind while I talk about the second kind of employment. And the second kind of employment is basically the one which is generated by the government. All right? These I'm going to call them the workfare schemes. So workfare schemes are programs launched by governments where benefits are given out against work. It's not a direct transfer, it's against work. Right? Now, India is clearly not a pioneer, but in terms of scale, it is clearly the largest workfare scheme we've seen anywhere in the world. But this has been tried out in Trabajar in Argentina. It has, variations of it has been tried in Thailand and in actually many European countries, particularly Germany. In the Indian context, it's called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, or the NREGS. And my research, I have a set of 3 papers which essentially got linked to NREGS, not by design. It was, I happened to fall upon it because I was studying different aspects of the NREGS. So the questions that I'm going to ask are, this seems to have a mind of its own. Okay, so the questions that I ask in terms of the NREGS is, has it achieved social protection? Meaning, what has the impact of the employment guarantee scheme been on poverty? And I'm going to tell you exactly what my definition of poverty is. Then, what impact has it had on rural-urban migration? All right, because essentially this is a rural employment guarantee scheme. So what impact does it have on the rural-urban migration, which is a natural flow for labor? And the third question I'm going to ask is, has it had any impact on microenterprises? Okay, so has it impacted the development of self-employed enterprise, self-employment? All right, and I'm going to answer all of them comprehensively. Now, to those of you unaware of the Indian context, let me start out by saying that India is an extremely poor country. And as per the Tendulkar Committee recommendation, which basically measured the poverty line quite comprehensively, in 2009, we know that 42% of rural Indians are below the poverty line, and 26% of urban Indians are below poverty line. So these are large numbers given the magnitude of the population. Now, rural unemployment in India is around 20%. But what you have to appreciate is that the way it is measured, this doesn't seem as high because there's a phenomenon called underemployment. Meaning when people are registered employed for at least 1 day in the week and they don't have anything else to do for the rest of the week, they are employed, but essentially they are underemployed. And underemployment in India is a very significant problem. Right? So now what about the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme? Now, given the context of poverty and unemployment, the Indian Parliament basically enacted, this is a rights-based scheme, which is called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. It was passed in the Indian Parliament in 2005, and it was rolled out in 2006 in the poorest 200 districts. We have 600 districts. And over the next 3 years, it was rolled out to the rest of the country. As per this act, essentially all rural Indian households, it's not targeted, all rural Indian households are entitled to 100 days of unskilled wage employment. Okay? Now, employment as per the NREGS has to be within 15 kilometers of, within 15 days of application and within 5-kilometer radius. Which you can imagine is a daunting task for a bureaucracy which is really not used to working that much. But to provide this level of employment within such a close space and at the rate, meaning within 15 days, is a daunting task, which is why you will see that essentially though people are guaranteed 100 days, there is a lot of job rationing, meaning there is a lot of demand for it, but people on an average work 49 days out of the year. Okay? Out of the 100 days that they are guaranteed. And the payment has to be within 15 days, and there are also unemployment doles. So if the government does not provide the employment, they are required to be given unemployment support, and that is really has to be paid by the state government. So it's the central government that pays all the wage bill, but if there's a delay, then the unemployment dole is provided by the state government. It's really to incentivize the state government to roll out. And of course, this is also keeping the minimum wages. Now, we do have a minimum wage law, but you can imagine in a labor surplus economy how difficult it is to basically implement minimum wages. So one of the key role that NREGS has done, has basically played, is in establishing a minimum rural wage in the unskilled labor market in India. Now, if you just look at the wages in the NREGS, it's actually higher. The NREGS wages for unskilled labor is higher in most states than the existing minimum wages. So you can imagine what that is doing to the, the overall minimum wages in the state. There's an upward pressure for wages, which could basically lead to a couple of problems. Here they are. There is one which economists call, and I want you to use it very objectively, there's a distortion in the market, meaning if the government starts out giving wages which are higher than what the existing market wages are, then it really reduces the incentive to go out and seek regular employment, which is in the market. If in general you see that people have started demanding more and more jobs as per the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, then naturally all that increased demand for government jobs is going to lead to rationing of jobs, because it's not easy to create that many jobs. So, and rationing of job is a phenomenon. It's a big problem within the NREGS. But if you do have rationing, what that does is it leads to discretionary power. Then who gets the job for how many days and so on and so forth, and that is a key concern as well. But of course, if the wages increase overall, then you can imagine that now this is an unskilled labor which has a good outside option in the form of government jobs. So their bargaining power as far as the private sector is concerned goes up. So they might actually get better private wages as well. Now the three questions that I start out asking: what impact has the NREGS had on poverty? Okay, and I'm going to particularly look at the impact of NREGS on the participating households. I think you just have to do it for me. Thanks. Okay, specifically what I'm going to look at is extreme poverty. We call it ultra poor. And the metrics based on which these households are targeted to study the impact of the NREGS was that there has to be a certain condition for housing, there has to be a certain minimum consumption expenditure within the household, no access to microfinance, the household has to be remote, you cannot have functional asset which has a cash flow. So these are basically the BRAC. For those of you from Bangladesh, these are the basic guidelines that BRAC has set about for basically targeting, measuring who ultra poor are. So in this paper, I look at the impact of NREGS on extreme poverty. Extreme poverty being measured, specifically I look at food security, meaning what happened to the monthly per capita consumption expenditure of the household, number of meals foregone, because many poor households forego several meals, and that can actually be measured, so I do that. And then I look at mental and physical health outcomes. I look at child's height and weight, and I look at incidence of depression, which actually is a severe problem in rural economy in India. And then I look at financial inclusion, meaning what is the incidence of saving, what is the probability of saving, and how much do you actually save. So these are the three metrics that I look at. Next. Now the data, you can just click next, is it's basically a panel data. So what I've been doing is following around 200 plus, 220 villages over last 6 years actually, in Andhra Pradesh, which is a middle income rising state, though it has the poorest districts, which is the one in study in that state. And selection, like I mentioned, was based on housing criterion, land ownership, asset ownership. So the baseline survey was done in 2007 and the end line was done in 2009. You can speed through this. Okay, so this you can, yeah, please click it. You will see that, these are typical randomized control trials where you go out and study like 1,500 variables because you keep going and, watching these households, you run, keep going, just. So this basically is to give you a sense of what the variables of interest are. They're all consumption details, asset owner details, hygiene levels, what is the medical and physical and mental health conditions, asset ownership. We have details on what are the borrowings and savings and who do they borrow from and of what form. We also have details on political participation, empowerment of women, how far they travel. So it's a very extensive study which we have conducted for this. Please continue next. Okay, so now what are the key impacts in terms of poverty? Yeah, okay. So what we saw is, now remember this is from 2007 to 2009, so it's essentially in the first 3 years of National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme that was launched. And there's a 10% increase, and these are real increases by the way, 10% increase in food consumption expenditure. Number of meals foregone declined significantly, meaning households are food secure because of the NREGS. Next. The other thing to note is, what happens when we do many of these quantitative studies, we get averages. We know what has happened on an average, but it's actually pretty much more interesting if you look at the distributional impact of this, because your households are fairly varied, even if they're all ultra poor. And we saw that the impact of the employment guarantee scheme is much more on the left tail, meaning the poorer households have actually gained a lot more from this employment guarantee scheme. In terms of the monthly per capita consumption expenditure. It increased the non-food consumables. Now what are these? These are typically your, what you spend on footwear and clothing and so on and so forth. That increased by 23%. It increased financial inclusion, meaning people are saving more, and their probability of saving also increased. Now one reason for that is that the NREG, the government pays wages into bank accounts. So everybody who's now seeking job and has got job as per the NREGS has also got a bank account. And that actually is one of the few metrics of financial inclusion. So everyone working for NREGS is financially included. But a more sophisticated measure is, are they saving? Are they keeping some of that money back? And is that increasing over time? And that is. All right. Now, in terms of height and weight of children under 13, because that's the age group where you see immediate impact, there has not been change in height and weight. In terms of physical health outcomes, though the number of days foregone, days of work foregone because of poor health has come down, it's not statistically significant. But what we do see statistically significant is the reduction in mental depression that people have talked about over the last 3 years. And that is actually a significant reduction in terms of anxiety and depression levels. Next. All right, so now that within the short span of 2.5 years, we've seen impact on households which are participating in the NREGS. We expanded, now this is another paper which essentially looked at the same program, but looked at the urban migration, rural to urban migration, because now people have work back in the house, within 5 kilometers of where they live, and at a minimum wage, which is also rising, remember. So their motivation to move to urban areas has actually come down. So we study rural-urban migration, yeah. I'm going to talk about urban unemployment, and because one of the immediate impact of the scheme is when there's the flow to urban area has come down, that has impacted urban unemployment in a positive way. It has actually brought it down. I'm also going to talk about what has happened to real wages because of the scheme in rural and urban areas. And I'm going to talk about the heterogeneity in effect, because different segments of the population, particularly when it has come to, when you look at skilled people are not affected, unskilled people are affected, women are affected of a certain type, particularly migration, which is related with marriage, has actually come down for women. Men are impacted much more. It's the informal sector in the services in urban area, which has actually seen a massive reduction in the flow. Yeah. So the impact of the NREGs and migration, yeah, these are just some of the numbers. This is to give you a sense of, the red line tells you the rural to urban migration. In terms of the population, what is happening, there's a steady increase before the NREGs was there. After the NREGs was implemented, it's like driving a car and lowering the speed. So you're going in the same direction, it's still very much upward, but the growth rate has come down. And that is what NREGs has significantly impacted. The green line is showing you the ratio between urban and rural population, which is gradually moving in favor of urban areas. Next. So what are the impacts? Well, overall, the growth of rural-urban migration has come down by 27%. So remember, it's still positive, but the growth has slowed. All right, next. Now, migration happens for very many reasons, and the National Sample Survey collects information on exactly why people migrate. And the main reason is employment, which is why we see that there's a 58% reduction, which is a significant, a massive reduction in the growth of urban, rural to urban migration for employment. Next. Now, most women migration happens for marriage, because what you will see is the rural-urban migration of men is followed by rural-urban migration of female, which is essentially for marriage. And again, the National Sample Survey data collects details on where they move from and what's the basic purpose. But marriage-related migration has also come down significantly by 34%. Yeah. Education-related migration, which is the third largest criteria, is unaffected because of the scheme, as would be expected, because this is an employment guarantee scheme for unskilled labor. So clearly, students who are moving out from rural to urban areas for higher education, they are unaffected. Now, one of the positive impact, though again, I'm going to talk about broadly what this means for an economy which is growing and urbanizing very rapidly. It has reduced urban unemployment by 38%, which is a massive increase, but remember, the way we measure urban unemployment is very screwed up. Essentially, if you have 1 day of work in a week, you're employed. So again, it's getting back to the underemployment. So urban unemployment in India, for instance, is 5%, which is ridiculously low. So a 38% reduction from 5% is really not that much. But at the level, if you look at it, it is a significant decline. Yes. It has raised the real rural wages for unskilled labor by 8% in the first year itself, okay, which is a massive increase. We have done this very large experiment called the Ultra Poor program, where the agenda is to transform very poor people, ultra poor, into micro-entrepreneurs. All right? The basic motivation comes from microfinance, but the idea is it's a targeted group of people whom you basically give an asset and training to take care of the asset so that they can then become, micro-entrepreneurs. Does it succeed? Does it fail? Let's see what happens. But basically, the Ultra Poor graduation program, the largest scheme, was run in Andhra Pradesh by an NGO called SKS, and we did the evaluation. But the CGAP and the Ford Foundation jointly have supported 10 pilots across 8 different countries. Yeah. Now, it basically targets ultra poor households and tries to transform them into micro-entrepreneurs. With essentially, one, you transfer an asset, all right, and you give them necessary training with certain amount of financial literacy to be able to take care of these assets. Yeah. And the entire intervention lasts 18 months, all right? Yeah, it's a fairly intensive scheme. And this is motivated again by BRAC in Bangladesh. Okay, so what is the intervention that the Ultra Poor program basically did? You meet with each ultra poor household in the treatment village to select an enterprise. Now, what are these enterprises? Clearly, these are not something that's sitting in New York, you think it's a good idea. These are the usual enterprises that this region does, all right? Which is, buffalo rearing, goats, sheep, poultry. Tailoring is a very, it's a very popular scheme there. A telephone booth, grocery stores, yeah. And then in the early stages, they're given an intensive training where they're basically, we get them across to a school, we keep them for 6 days and we train them. Yeah. And then the asset is procured with the help of the household, it's transferred to them, insured and transferred, yeah. And then after that we have weekly meetings, again inspired by microfinance, where you keep a tab. Every week you're basically seeing what is the cash flow, how much did you spend, how much did you save, yeah. Now this is just to motivate you if you're getting, sleepy. goats, and these are the usual micro-enterprises. Buffalo, in fact, was the most popular because 60% of our households chose buffaloes. Now, these are not insignificant amounts of money. These assets are roughly just a little below $300, which is a large amount of money for a triple household. Yeah. Okay, so what's the experiment design? It's a randomized control trial. Yeah, you can just quickly go over a lot of this. Now, it's a randomized control trial, so there are around 200 villages, and you separate them into treatment control. All the villages in the treatment get this particular treatment, meaning we give them the assets, and we train them, and we see what the impact is. We evaluate the program in the short run, which is right after the intervention finishes, which is around 2 years. It's 18 months to 2 years. And then in the long run, which means we go back after everything is over to see who survives, who becomes an entrepreneur. And so in the long run, what is the scheme of things as far as the enterprise is concerned? So what are the basic results? Very disappointing. There are no long-term statistically significant impact of the program on income, consumption, asset accumulation. All right? In the long run, in fact, 3 years later when we went back to see who remained in business, more than half the treatment households have actually, they have sold off their assets and they have joined the casual labor market. Okay? Yeah. So now what is happening? The Ultra Poor program, this particular scheme is rolled out exactly at the same time when the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme is implemented by the government. Before we did this intervention, they were 94%, they were casual laborers. Okay? So this is what they usually do. Now, what does the NSSO data say for the entire country, not just the 300 villages we're following? The NSSO, National Sample Survey data, which is the most comprehensive data out of India at the household level, there's a 27% increase in real rural wages over the first 5 years of the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Okay, next. The same data also shows that for these districts that we are studying, which is in Andhra Pradesh, because the government is very proactive, this is Andhra Pradesh, so the implementation of the scheme is extremely aggressive, it's very rapid expansion. There, the real rural wages have increased almost 40%, which is, you can imagine, it's a huge tectonic shift as far as rural labor markets are concerned. So, what do we conclude? Overall, we are seeing that there's a huge, rapid increase in casualization of labor. All right? Yeah. There's a significant decline in self-employment. This is no longer our data, okay? This is overall country. So what we found in these study villages is exactly the trend you're seeing in the rest of the country, where there's a rapid increase in casual labor and there's a decline in self-employment. There's no significant asset creation through this program. Now, this is something key because if employment is being given out, is guaranteed to do road building or water harvesting, or the kind of schemes that we laid out as per the National Employment Guarantee Scheme, the outcome doesn't necessarily only have to be redistributive, because the motive of the scheme was to ensure guarantee, but also to create assets in the rural areas which would then fold into the growth process overall, raising the rural productivity within India. Yeah. Now, there's no skill formation, because most of them are digging wells or holes and then filling them in subsequent years. There's been a lot of debate on this in India because the role of the NREGS now has to be expanded such that people actually gain real skills and become employable. Yeah. To say that, you know, when employment is generated through government machinery, the way we have, it's a very well-intended scheme, and it is having positive impact on beneficiary households within the short run. But it's also distorting labor markets in ways which is making the scheme increasingly costly in terms of the opportunity cost, if you will, for the same set of households. Now, almost all the theoretical literature that we have in economics on workfare schemes, we say that eventually the benefit levels of these kind of schemes should be set in such a way that it is self-targeted to those who most need it. All right, which means you want to minimize the distortions in the labor market. Yeah. You also, over time, want to reduce the dependency on such schemes. You want people to get out and get regular employment, not be dependent 100% on government employment schemes. Yeah. Yeah. Eventually, you want to skill people so that they become employable. All right. And of course, you want to create assets through employment generation, which can then feed into the productivity of the rural areas as a whole. All right, so the elephant and the gorilla in the room. Eventually, I want to end with my final point, which is that whether it is employment through the market or employment through the social protection or government scheme, the one big missing piece which governments have to address are the labor laws. That's my final point. It should really be this, not just a picture, there must be another something there. Okay, all right. It's the labor law reforms, okay? Countries have to address labor laws. Because if you don't have appropriate labor laws, which makes it easier for enterprises to grow and employ people, you will have the kind of distortions that we are witnessing in India, all right? Whether it is through the government or directly through the market. Thank you very much.